Hi, this is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast. This weekend, we are offering 5 conversations from episode 19. Our review of last week's ICER public comment session on their assessment of obeticholic acid and resmetirom. Plus, from the vault, conversation 36.5 from season 3. Last July's wrap-up of our conversation about Intercept Pharmaceutical and their release of updated Regenerate data on obeticholic acid. This conversation focuses on the specific testimonies our panelists gave and the reasoning behind them. Mike Betel discusses why he chose to focus on the personal side of the disease by describing the case of his daughter, her challenges with weight management, the success of her bariatric surgery on her NASH, and then that she's had significant health challenges after the surgery and as a result of it. Wayne Eskridge says that he focused on the issue of NASH being a progressive disorder because he personally was a fast progressor. I asked whether Wayne lives with type 2 diabetes, which he does not, because of recent work from Rohit Lumba's group at UCSD about how quickly diabetic patients progress in terms of fibrosis. Tony Villiotti explains that he chose to discuss significant fallacies in the populations and numbers chosen for the economic analysis, being a numbers guy. As the conversation winds down, we discuss the value and viability, or in both cases lack thereof, from doing an economic model of drugs with no stated prices. In our first conversation on the ICER preliminary report, GLI Vice President of Liver Health Programs Jeff McIntyre said he appreciated patients having a voice, but noted that that's not the same thing as having a vote. Patient advocates' comments in this conversation make it clear exactly how wide the gap between the two is right now. Fortunately, as Veronica Miller noted during our first ICER report episode, ICER reporting has no impact on FDA decisions, but as we discussed during this conversation, it might have an impact on payers. Progress is a long journey, so let's all keep pushing. And while you do, listen, sit back, enjoy, learn, and when you're done, join the discussion in our LinkedIn discussion group. So I want to go to the specific testimonies that each of you gave and why you chose to approach it in the way you did and what you think the import of your testimony was. Mike, I listened to yours most recently, so I'll probably ask you to go first.
Mike Betel.
Sure. I gave the example, although I had NAFLD myself and was able to clear it through those lifestyle management approaches, my daughter had NASH and took an extreme solution, which isn't for everybody, and that was the gastric bypass. And I thought and was really frustrated by the fact that the document really made light of solutions like bariatric surgery, saying, oh, lifestyle management or bariatric surgery are other alternatives. And it's like, okay, it takes months and months of work to be able to even get worked up to be able to do the surgery. Then you have to go through basically a lifetime commitment to the way you eat and drink and everything. On top of that, for my daughter's situation, although she did eliminate the NASH and half her body weight, she then had to have her gallbladder removed. And then again, just last week, she had complications because of the gallbladder involvement with bile and stuff. And so it just goes on and on and on. And who knows what the future is. And I did read a lot lately. The gallbladder is involved in a lot of this. So that's where my take was. And I really wanted to share the personal side of it, saying that this is not an easy journey. It's not like, well, if we don't give them the medication, they can just take care of it on their own. It's just not that easy. And as we talked about earlier today as well, that was the focus of what I talked about.
Yeah, the thing that I found most compelling in your comment is the thing you just went back to, which is not just that your daughter, had surgery, liver improved, lost half her weight. Okay, if the story ends there, that's one story. When you go on to gallbladder and ongoing complications, that's very different because it says the story never ends.
I don't know the ending yet. Hopefully it's good.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so alphabetical order. Wayne, why did you choose to comment on it that way?
Wayne Eskridge.
I focused on their position of this was a non-progressive disease because my personal experience, I turned out to be a fast progressor myself. I went from an F2 to an F4 in 5 years. It became evident to me as I learned more about it that that was quite a dangerous place for me. So their minimizing of the progressive aspects of it really caught my attention. So I basically focused on trying to give some examples of this is progressive. It is a disease that, although very subtle, our problem is that the symptoms are so subtle in the early stages, and we usually write them off as, well, that's just what getting older feels like. Lose your fatigue and your sleep problems and the gastro problems that you just develop over the years. We just write that off to being older. And in many cases, it's really symptomatic of progressing liver disease. So that was my focus. I wanted to complain about the biopsy, about the costs that they were using. The primary focus was just to comment about the nature of progression. And they really were offended by my use of the Paul Angulo study, which did a hazard ratio comparison of mortality, the odds ratio of mortality between diabetes and stage 1 and stage 2 and smoking. And that data says that those are more hazardous to your overall life extent than is diabetes or smoking. And they gave me a lot of pushback about that.
Wayne, remind me, at the time you were diagnosed, were you living with type 2 diabetes as well or not?
No, I've never had diabetes. I just have a pure NASH. I had a gallbladder out, but no other organ systems involved.
Okay, because the reason I ask is because sitting stacked up on my desk of my academic papers to take a look at is something that came out of Rohit Lumba's group in San Diego recently, suggesting that for a type 2 diabetic, one level progression of NASH could take 4 years, not the 7 that people have always talked about. So at that point, 2 to 5 doesn't become such a crazy fast progression for people with diabetes. Now, you're still a fast progressor, but Wayne, I've always thought of you as an overachiever.
Yeah, that's great. But Lumba's paper was really good. I think that's really so important information that people need to know because so many of us have diabetes, and that puts a different clock on things, and that's important.
Yeah, and by the way, I didn't notice in the ICER paper that they said the disease is not progressive except in diabetics. They just said it's not progressive, back at using old data or wrong impressions. Tony
Villiotti.
Yeah, my focus, and I guess this is from my background as a numbers guy, I focus more on the economic side of the paper. And my concern was if they got the cost-benefit analysis wrong, then what they were doing was kind of a waste. And the thing I did was I started looking at the citations they had for their inputs to the economic model. And the article that they based a lot of their inputs on, I discovered was very flawed. It was based on only people under 65 years of age. And there's a study by Dr. Yanasi that showed in the United States that about 3/4 of the spending on advanced liver disease is for people over 65. So that excluded the vast portion of the population. That was compounded by the fact they only considered people who had commercial private insurance. And that excluded anybody on Medicaid. So they really based their numbers on a very narrow slice of the population. I didn't mention this in my talk, but the thing that jumped out at me, it was almost like, using a biopsy to evaluate the liver. They were taking a narrow slice of data. I also thought they got wrong the cost of a transplant. When this was mentioned in the questions that had followed my presentation, the guy said, well, maybe it was wrong, but it really doesn't make a difference. Well, that doesn't speak well to the economic model. If you can get something wrong by a factor of 2 and it has no impact on your answer. So my comments as a retired CPA were more on the economic side.
Louise Campbell.
Can I ask a dumb question here? If you don't know the cost of the drug, is it a pointless exercise anyway? Because neither company have said what the cost of their medication is going to be. And it was based on old costings. Is that my understanding?
That's what they did. They kind of assumed a cost that may or may not have any bearing in reality. So I agree. What's the point?
So it was a pointless economic evaluation in the first place.
You could certainly say that.
Yeah, I guess in theory, you could argue that it gives people a clue as to how to evaluate whatever prices they're thinking of charging against the model that will be used to evaluate it. I don't think that's what anybody had in mind. But
what do they do for other drugs that are soon to be approved? Do they also, I think they generally do pharmacoeconomic estimates.
Yeah, but because there are no drugs approved in this disease, and because OCA is improved for PBC at, $75,000 a year, whatever the number is, or more than that now, it becomes very hard to figure out where to plant the flag. So I think in that regard, they had a unique challenge. Now, why do this analysis before you know the prices? That's an interesting question. And Louise, there the answer is if you're trying to put your thumb on the scale and tip people in favor of don't charge more than this, and by the way, if charge as little as you can, maybe that makes sense. But when you do that with so many flawed assumptions, I don't know who carries those assumptions forward. Back at Tony's point, if you do it right, well, let's try it this way. If missing on the cost of transplant by a factor of 2 doesn't matter in this analysis, is there a drug price at which it would matter? Because if it wouldn't matter at any drug price, then you get to a pointless exercise badly done. What's the old Woody Allen line about bad food in small portions? Pointless analysis done badly. But if they're trying to put their thumb on the scale of what are people going to charge, what will Madrigal charge, more specifically, I think. Because I've said this on this podcast before, I think the pricing issues around OCA are really very challenging for them.
I think it's interesting. It takes me back. If we look at figures in the UK, for example, if you look at the F2 and above fibrosis and the cost that's worked out here, that cost per year, I think, was around about 2.5 million. But not looking for the other numbers in the F1s and below, the cost to society was 19 million. So we're looking to treat the ones who actually cost healthcare the least, because we're not looking for the ones who cost healthcare the most, which are the ones with the mild disease. And I think it was Wayne that mentions a lot about the different levels of fibrosis having but greater impact than diabetes. Then that to me brings us back to what we're looking at. My figures, it wasn't millions, it was billions. So it was about 2.5 billion in the higher group and 19 billion in the group that we're not looking for healthcare costs that were attributed. So that, for me, sways the economic argument of who we should be putting these medications in for and where we should be helping. So the lower end to stop progression on a non-progressive disease, according to ICER.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingnash.com. Next week's topic's a bit up in the air, but all our options are superb. I'm sure you'll enjoy the episode. So until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.